All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we are actually going to pick up in the exact same spot that we finished last time because we're looking at natural selection as being this primary mechanism for adaptive evolution, right? But in order for that natural selection to occur, genetic variation has to be present in the population for that given characteristic that we're studying. Otherwise, natural selection can't do its job. It needs to have variation because there needs to be the ability for that differential success based on some variation. So I need you to have a different trait than me because that then allows for that natural selection to sort of quote unquote choose who's going to move forward. And really, remember, it's not about a choice. It's just a matter of being successful or not compared to somebody else. So here's the thing. When we talk about genetic variation, which is what we're going to kind of focus on here today, at least in a broad sense. We'll come back to talking about some more of these topics we mentioned today in some more detail when we get to some of these concepts later in the year. But genetic variation is heritable in order for natural selection to work, but there are a lot of things that interplay in your genetics that ultimately go from DNA to protein and in the way that your body uses that protein. So what we're looking at here is this connection between genotype and phenotype, right? Genotype is your actual DNA code. That's the molecules, that's the sequence of A's, T's, C's, and G's that you inherit from your parents. The phenotype is the protein piece. It's the physical expression of that set of instructions. And when we talk about those proteins, the way that those proteins form and the way that they interact in your cells then determines your phenotype, but there's a lot more influence going on at multitudes of levels, and that's where this piece comes in. So it says, however, variation is not always heritable, and that's true, kind of. So when we talk about natural selection, we're talking about nature, quote unquote, choosing based on reproductive success and based on a set of environmental conditions, right? So really, natural selection works at the phenotype level, at the protein level, because that's what's going to be the expression of the set of instructions. So natural selection, let me say this again, naturally directly works on your phenotype of your organism. It's indirectly working on the genotypic level because based on your phenotype, that's a result of your instructions, that's a result of your genotype. That genotype is what you pass on. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, rewind that video, listen to that again. All right, so phenotype is what natural selection works directly on. It works indirectly on your genotype as a result of who survives and what set of instructions get passed on to the next generation. So here's where things get a little muddled. Because it's working at that phenotypic level, your phenotypes are often a culminating product of both your genotype, so your set of DNA instructions, and other environmental influences. And this is something that we'll get into a little bit later on this year when we talk about epigenetics. So for now, just understand that your environment can influence the expression of your genes. And that's what this particular example is here with these moths. So same species of moth, same set of instructions, and yet I've got this particular butterfly who emerges in the spring, and because of environmental conditions at that point in the year, we end up getting this brown and orange coloration. I get that same butterfly to emerge late in the summer, and you can see that the coloration changes. And think about how environmental conditions are different in the spring versus the summer. Temperature, light levels, all sorts of things. Food availability. Okay, so those environmental conditions are playing a part in the way that this same species of butterfly takes its set of instructions, uses it to produce proteins, and those proteins are the colors that we're seeing in their wings. So we have to understand just some basics about genetics. Environment can play a role, and then there's also a lot of ways that genes just get inherited. Um, Go back to your underclassmen biology course and think about the genetic patterns you talked about. Most of the things that we teach students when they learn genetics for the first time are those Mendelian traits, right? What Mendel would have studied in his pea plants. And so we talk about characteristics being sort of this or that. Either I'm this or I'm that. And that's what you're seeing in things like these purple flowers and these white flowers, right? They're either dominant or they're recessive. Period. I got two options. There's not a whole lot of traits in real nature that actually follow that. In fact, Mendel was incredibly lucky to have found the sheer amount of traits he did in a single plant that he did to get all of the studies that he was able to do with those pea plants. Because a lot of characteristics actually work over a continuum, especially a lot of coloration patterns. Think about it in human skin or hair color or eye color even. There's a lot of variation. It's not just your purple or white. And so that means that there's probably a multitude of genes that are influencing it in order to create that. So things like polygenic traits and stuff like that. And then we can throw in combinations of traits that come from your sexual inheritance and all sorts of things that can start muddying the waters when we talk about this. So regardless of how we want to define what kind of gene we're talking about, they all have polymorphisms. Anytime we're looking at discrete characteristics that come in discrete forms, each form is called a morph. All right. And so we can have phenotypic polymorphisms, where I'm talking about a population that has one or two or maybe three distinct characteristics for that trait, right? You're either a white flower, a red flower, or a pink flower. Those would be phenotypic polymorphisms. And each of those has their own set of frequencies that are readily notable, theoretically easy to count, and then as those change from one generation to the next, we can monitor and calculate those frequencies. Genetic polymorphisms are heritable components of that characteristic. These are often more along that continuum. So having 4 traits that code for skin color, and the more dominance you have, the more you're on one end of the spectrum, the more recessive you receive, you're on the other, and most people are some mixture in between. So when we go to try to measure this genetic variation, population geneticists will often measure the number of polymorphisms in the population, really with the goal of trying to determine the amount of heterozygosity that exists. All right. So if I'm looking at the gene level, we use this idea of average heterozygosity. So looking at the amount of individuals in the population who have that heterozygote trait. Okay, so they've got a dominant and a recessive. And that may mean that they have their own distinct characteristic, like that pink flower, in a situation of incomplete dominance, or they're somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. We can also look at heterozygosity at the molecular level and talk about nucleotide variability. And now I'm digging directly into the DNA sequence of individuals and comparing data that way. When we look at average heterozygosity, this tends to be greater in the population than that nucleotide variability. So genes tend to consist of thousands of bases. If only a single base is different to make 2 alleles in that particular trait, that's where we get this larger amount of heterozygosity. Where if I'm looking directly at comparing your DNA sequence to somebody else's, and you've got 100 bases, but only one is different, that's why that nucleotide variability would be considerably lower, because it's only a 1% difference, as opposed to actually looking at the expression of that, which is where that average heterozygosity comes in.